And now, please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. One of my very clear memories as a child were the times when my parents would host dinner parties. It was a special occasion around the house, and this is me, a little kid in elementary school. And I remember because we had our formal dining room that we only used for occasions like that. And my mother would bring out the silver and the silver candelabra and polish the things that needed to be polished, prepare a meal, and then when their friends came over, back in those days everyone would dress up, even for dinner parties, going to a friend's house. And we were sent off to bed as kids, but I remember as a little kid like sneaking down the stairs and peeking around and just watching all the adults there at the table. All of us, I'm sure, have great memories of sitting around a table, sharing a meal with other people, just how enriching that can be, how you get to learn deeply about someone, how you get to be entertained and just have fun. You get to argue important points of the day. Well, one of the things about our society today is how much less common these scenarios are than they once were 40 or 50 years ago. I remember talking to my brother and sister-in-law years ago when they still live in Winnetka, and I asked how many times that they had their friends over for dinners like our parents used to do. And they said, well, we just don't do that. Our kids are young, we're busy with our 2 jobs, there just isn't the time anymore. Back in the 1990s, there was a famous book written by the Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam entitled Bowling Alone. Putnam coined the term social capital, the benefits we get by our social connections in their many forms. And one thing that Putnam pointed out in the 90s is that from the 1950s to the 1990s, there was a dramatic decrease in social capital in the United States. People less frequently were having people over for dinners and cocktail parties. They didn't join bowling leagues like they did in the past, hence the name of the book, Bowling Alone. They didn't join the Rotary Club in the same numbers the Lions Club or even churches. That decline in social capital meant people were less happy. It led to greater violence in society, decrease in trust. Putnam pointed out pretty convincingly that a decline in social capital has any number of social ills, and the solution, of course, is to be more hospitable, to join things. Well, we all know how tough it can be. I mean, you're trying to entertain, and I'm one of these people, I say that people fall into 2 categories, as you hear quite often, and 2 of these categories people fall into are those who clean as they go and those who clean the next morning. And I am 100% a clean the next morning person. The downside of that is sometimes it's not just the next morning, but the morning after, and sometimes even the morning after. We know how all these things take time, but they're also so valuable. Particularly, I'll say about a place like Boston. One of the things about Boston that I don't like, and again, I love my home city, but one of the things I don't like about Boston, people just do not extend their social circles to new people. That's not in the DNA of Boston. I've never been to a place where people show up at a bar, they come with their friends, they talk with just their friends, and they leave with their friends, and if you have the gall to try and say hi to them, they look at you like, why are you talking to me? And the same thing is oftentimes in social gatherings. To a remarkable degree, you go to social gatherings, and the people at the social gathering all are shockingly homogenous. How often do we extend our networks to include people that are not like us, through our interests, careers, jobs, age? In Boston, that happens very rarely. Now, for me, I've told you this before, but when I was a kid, one of the things that shapes my views on hospitality is that when I was a kid, I was just a profound dork and nerd. And that got in the way of my relationships with my peers. So my worst grade in first grade was not getting along well with his peers. I still remember that. And I was just like a big dork, and so I would read books, say in first grade, on dinosaurs, and then I just assumed that all my classmates wanted to hear everything I'd read about dinosaurs when I first met them. It turns out that was not the case. And going through elementary school, I had a few close friends, but very much was a loner and kept to myself. And I remember very distinctly being excluded from certain social circles. And then I remember when I went to Roxbury Latin in 7th grade, of course, we're all going to a private school that's a day school, so we're traveling, and we're leaving our old friend groups behind, but the new friend groups take time to form. When I was in 7th and 8th grade, I know I've said this before, when I was in 7th and 8th grade, every single weekend I got on the phone and tried to call up people to hang out with, and every single week for 2 years, I was told that people were too busy. It's a tough thing as a teenager to feel so alone, so isolated. But for me, one of the reasons why hospitality and inclusion matter so much is because I was not included when I was younger. And those memories from our young age stick with us. And so I've almost had it like a passionate mission in life as I've become more extroverted and realized how much I do enjoy social interaction and can usually refrain from going on long speeches in the middle of social gatherings, usually. I reach out to other folks. When I was in divinity school, you probably don't want to know this about your pastor, but when I was in divinity school, I held one leadership position in the 3 years of divinity school. The one leadership position I held is I was the president of what they called the Night Walking Society, which was the organization at Yale Divinity School that there were the people that promoted fun on campus. So I was the social czar for Yale Divinity School. And then when I went to work at Memorial Church at Harvard, I was working at the chapel, and there was no logical social group. So again, I found myself very alone. I wasn't a part of any grad school. I wasn't a part of the administration. I wasn't a student. I really had no natural social circle. And so I was like, well, it's time to create one. So the spring of my first year working at Memorial Church, I realized there was no gay bar anywhere in Harvard Square. This was shocking to me. And so I was like, I'm going to change that. And I reached out to all the leaders of all the gay groups in the entire university. I met with them. Someone said, oh, the person you really have to know is Tim McCarthy. So the person who spoke at my installation, who stayed with me many times, who I'm still very, very close friends with, I met Tim initially because I was like, we got to make this place more social. And so Tim was like, well, let's take over my favorite bar, Daedalus. And so we did. On Thursdays, we took over Daedalus. And it was so crowded, people couldn't get in the door. Years later, I remember long after I left Cambridge, someone saying, oh, Daedalus, it's still a fun place for gays to hang out on Thursdays. And I'm like, do you know where that started? They're like, no. I was like, and then when I went to Iowa, and I was living in Iowa, Ames, Iowa, university town, again, there weren't a lot of social spaces. And I had the privilege when I was in Iowa for a year and a half to rent out a room from my very dear friend Matthew, who happens to be sitting in the pews right there, who was a professor at Iowa State University. And Matthew had this beautiful home, and we lamented the fact that there weren't healthy, good social spaces, particularly for gay men in Iowa. There was no bar around for people to go to, and so people just met in these meaningless connections online. And we thought this was a big problem. So we opened up the house once a month for anyone to come. Open door for whoever wanted to show up. Matthew cooked. He's a brilliant cook. I tended bar. We had people driving from 45 minutes away each way just to come to some of these social gatherings because they were so starved for social spaces. And there were people of all different ages, different backgrounds. There were like 14 different passports I counted at one point. From 40 to 80 people coming at Christmas time. We would sing Christmas carols. I mean, there was a piano there. This is a bunch of gays, so of course someone can play the piano. And they just started playing. And it was great fun. And then when I went to Houston, again, tried to create social spaces as best I could, where anyone was welcome. And people would just show up sometimes at random parts of the day in my house. They'd just knock on the door. And sometimes knowing that it was usually unlocked, they just walk right in. And I was like, great, how are you? In our text for this morning, from Genesis 18, it comes immediately after Genesis 17, which is one of the covenants that God makes with Abraham. And in Genesis 17, Abraham gets the name Abraham and has the instruction to circumcise all of the males in his family and all the Israelites. And then in chapter 18, God shows up. And the way the text is set up, Abraham doesn't know that God has shown up. There are 3 visitors that appear in the heat of the day. And if you read the text, one of the remarkable things, again and again, it shows how much haste Abraham showed. First, he said, "Will you please not pass by your servant? I want to show you hospitality." Without asking their names or who they were. And then goes and rushes here, makes haste. Sarah makes haste to bring out a fatted calf. A lot of money. The finest of their flowers, the finest of their milk, and to make sure that they were rested, had water for their feet, did all of that before asking their names or getting to know them. This became the paradigmatic example of hospitality to strangers. This is the kind of thing that you should do. As I'm sure you know, in the ancient Near East, this was particularly important. The ability to actually have water and food in the middle of a desert climate can be the difference between life and death. And even to this day, particularly Bedouin peoples in that same area, have as a sacrosanct value the value of hospitality. And it's no mistake that just after this text is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the great sin of Sodom was a lack of hospitality. And as punishment for their lack of hospitality, the city was destroyed. And there's that great line in the book of Hebrews that references this text that says that we should extend hospitality to strangers, for in so doing we might entertain angels without knowing it. Because grace shows up when we extend hospitality. When I was at those gatherings at Harvard, one day this person came into the space and we were chatting. Ended up following a great conversation, became one of my dearest friends, and was a rock for me for the next several years, this guy named Paul. If that space hadn't been created, I would never have met him. When Matthew and I were in Iowa, we found out later at one of those gatherings, 2 people met their future spouse there. Because that gathering existed, they met one another. When I lived in Houston, I remember that having people over one night, and one of my friends who I knew pretty well surprised us by saying he was going to go into the military, and this was not someone who should be going into the military. And there's nothing against the military, just this particular individual was not a good fit. And so we were talking around the dinner table, and one of the people who happened to be there was one of my friends who was a veteran of the Navy. And so he had the chance to talk to him about his experience being in the military. And for him, one of the experiences that was tough on him is that he was in the military and he was in the Navy, and as an enlisted person, he orchestrated some of the missile control systems on the ship that he was on. And he remembers at one point sending missiles that ended up killing people. And how that still weighed on his conscience years later. And that was an important conversation for this individual, helping him realize, my other friend, realize that the military might not be the right fit for him. When I was here in Wellesley, having a friend here who was in the middle of discerning his professional stuff, an academic who was having difficulty getting the kind of academic job he wanted and discerning whether he should be an administrator, and listening to him and talking to him, and now he's the dean of the department of where he works. When I was in Houston, one of my good friends, this guy named Julian, very bright, very charming, but someone who's had a very hard life. He's an African-American guy who experienced a lot of racism. He was basically kicked out of his house when he was younger, struggled with some mental health issues, and really did not have an easy go of it. Unfortunately, in life, some people really do get short straws. And I did my best to be a friend of Julian, pushing him to do better things in his life, but whenever he was in need, there were various points he was in between places he would stay. He would be staying in my guest room. And I tried to include him when I could. I remember when I left, he showed up to say goodbye. He gave me a big hug. And the one thing he said, I won't forget, he looked around and he said, "This place was like home." A place that he didn't have in the rest of his life. Hospitality affects us, changes us, brings grace into our lives in ways that we can't even imagine. And in our text for this morning, God is telling us, encouraging us to be more hospitable, to welcome those we might not welcome, to stretch ourselves in new ways, to extend grace to others. And that's something that we do here in this space too. I remember Judy Swanberg, one of the lines that she said that stuck with me that I guess Craig used to say back in the day. She's like, you need to come to church on Sunday morning. Not just for you, because you never know by your presence here who you might meet and what conversation you might have and how important that might be to the person in the pews next to you. That when people get welcomed into a space like this, where we do our best to welcome everyone, people come in with all sorts of burdens through that door. And maybe a kind word, a friendly conversation, an invite to coffee hour, you never know how that bit of grace can help change that person's life. So let us go out and be hospitable people. Be those good Christians. And you never know. In the process, you might find yourself entertaining angels without knowing it.